having me again this year. Last year I was here to talk about the pervasive online censorship that exists in corporate spaces. And this year I'm going to talk a little bit more about government-level internet censorship, specifically in the Middle East and North Africa. And if anyone's wondering why that's my particular interest, I will tell you straight off the bat that I lived in Morocco for 3 years, and it was during that time that I first discovered internet censorship. And so you can see why there's sort of a natural inclination to lean toward the region. Great. So I'm going to start with just a brief history of what we've seen over the past couple of decades since the internet reached across the region. So in 1991, Tunisia becomes the very first country in the Arab world to get on the internet. And by 1996, individuals have access to the internet in their homes or in schools. It's not widespread at this point. We're talking less than 5% internet penetration overall throughout the country. But nonetheless, it is the first. And I think that it's kind of nice that Tunisia was not only the first country to get on the internet, but also the first country to have this wonderful revolution last year. Between 1991 and 2000, most of the region managed to trickle online, and by 2000, Syria and Saudi Arabia were the last two countries in the region to offer internet access to the people. In 2005, the OpenNet initiative, and I will say right now, I used to work there, so all bias out of the way, they released research on Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, and Bahrain, detailing by technical means the censorship that was taking place on the internet in those countries. Aside from that, they also provided background as to the press freedom, for example, or to the legal and regulatory frameworks and surveillance characteristics in these countries. And what we saw at the time was that these three countries, as well as a few others, were pervasively censoring the internet, blocking political websites, religious content, human rights websites. At the time, they also released studies on China, Iran, and a few other countries. But again, I'm sticking to this region for now. And so what we saw was that countries were cracking down on the internet from a fairly early date. This research started in 2005, but the censorship started much earlier, and there's plenty of documentation to attest to that. By 2009, so I'm going with 2009 because we saw the end of 2010 as the start of the so-called Arab Spring. By 2009, the research by the OpenNet initiative and by observation as well showed heavy censorship in more than 6 Arab countries, with lesser censorship elsewhere. And let me just give you an example of what this looks like. So in Saudi Arabia, a group called the Arab Network for Human Rights Information, based in Cairo, found that in, I think, about 2001, 2002, Saudi Arabia was already blocking 200,000 websites. By the next year, that number had doubled, and by now we're looking at probably over 1 million. In Tunisia, it was similarly pervasive, but in a different way. So all of these countries are different, and that's the one thing that I would like to point out, is that while Saudi Arabia has focused traditionally on blocking information on human rights, women's rights, pornography, Syria never blocked pornography. True story. Keeps the people busy and happy. Syria was blocking political content. They were blocking Facebook and YouTube and Blogger. So they were focused heavily on making sure that people did not have access to outside information and did not have the capability to share information with the outside world. Whereas Saudi Arabia was more concerned with morality. And I'll get to that bit in a minute. But the milder censorship, let me give you an example of what that looked like. So I moved to Morocco in 2004, and I'd been blogging for a few years at that point on LiveJournal. You remember LiveJournal? OK, well, started in the US, now owned by a Russian company. But LiveJournal was kind of one of your very first online diary platforms. And when I got to Morocco, I thought, I'll just continue writing on this blog, and then I can share my experiences and my thoughts with my friends and family back home, of course. So I go to log into the site, and I can't get to it. And I didn't really know at the time, in 2004, what this meant. Well, what it meant was that the government had blocked the website. And the reason behind this was that there were a number of LiveJournal blogs and communities dealing with the Western Sahara, which is a red line in Morocco that you do not cross. And so The more I looked and the more I searched, I found that Morocco was not blocking access to pornography. They were not blocking YouTube, which was brand new at the time. They were not blocking really any social sites. They weren't blocking other blogging platforms. They were very, very specifically trying to block access to information about the Western Sahara. And if you ask people in Morocco, they will tell you, in their opinion, that the Western Sahara is part of Morocco. It's not a country. Meanwhile, it is a territory that has an independence movement. I'm not going to get into politics. But suffice it to say, this was what the Moroccan government cared about blocking access to. By 2009, you had 2009 deemed, and I think this was by somebody from my own government, from the US State Department, deemed 2009 the worst year ever for internet censorship. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. In 2009, we saw the uprising in Iran. We saw China come up with this Green Den youth escort idea. We also saw Egypt beginning to compete with China and Iran as the country jailing the most bloggers. We saw countries move toward heavier censorship. Syria had, at the time, had just a couple years before started blocking YouTube blogger, as I mentioned before. Tunisia had, at this point, blocked just about every possible video sharing site that existed on the internet. Again, I'll get to that in a minute. And yet, it's still gotten worse from 2009. So, pre-Arab Spring, and I'm saying pre-2010, let's say, these are the countries in the region that were pervasively blocking the internet. And again, that means a wide range of sites. These are designations that the Open Net Initiative put together. They're not necessarily scientifically precise. But what they mean is essentially a range of different categories of websites and a lot of sites, a lot of URLs. And so in all of these countries here, you had pretty much political content definitely blocked. Some of them were blocking pornography, some not so much, human rights information, basically anything that governments could do to ensure that people were not going to fight back against the government. And we've seen this time and time again all over the world, not just in this region. And then you had Jordan and Libya and Morocco playing a little bit with internet censorship, but really not blocking that many sites. Now, Jordan and Morocco, you've got a relatively open media environment to begin with, they certainly have problems, but wow, room is shaking. Certainly a much freer media than these countries. And then I use the word free, but as I'll explain in a little bit, that only means that they weren't blocking websites. Iraq didn't really have the capacity, as you might imagine, given everything that's happened. Egypt chose intentionally not to block websites, and that's another point that I will elaborate upon later. And Algeria was another country where you just don't have that many internet users. And so when a government makes the decision to censor in the first place, they kind of have to weigh, will this cause revolt? Will this backfire on us, essentially? And is it worth it? And so if you look at countries, there is a correlation all over the world between the number of internet users in a country and the pervasiveness of the censorship. Now, of course, there are other factors, the type of government, the press freedom environment, generally speaking. But there's only one country that I know of that has extremely low internet penetration and still blocks websites, and that's Ethiopia. For the most part, the rest of the world, if there aren't internet users, there's not much point. So how do governments justify censorship? How do they explain it? We've seen a variety of different levels of transparency around internet censorship all over the world again, but particularly in the region. And so you've got the religion and morality. Now, this is what Saudi Arabia loves to use as their excuse. Of course, you don't want the people to access information that might jeopardize their religious beliefs. And perhaps that's justifiable. It's not. But they often use this to also block things like information to sexual health, which is vital to people. And so while it might be justifiable to block pornography, it's definitely not justifiable by any means to block sexual health. It's not justifiable to block anything. OK, so you've got national security and terrorism. Now, again, I'm never going to argue for censorship. But again, there are reasons that a government might consider blocking genuine, like, let's say, how to make a bomb. They might want to block that. Not going to argue with at least the mindset, even though I think the solution is wrong. But then again, national security becomes far more than just blocking how to make a bomb. It becomes blocking dissent, blocking dissenters, arresting dissenters, as we'll see in a moment. Copyright. So this isn't so much an issue in the region, and so I'm not going to talk about it, but I think everyone is aware, and I want to make sure that you all know, since I'm American, I'm standing up here talking about how awful it is that there's censorship in the Middle East, and my government's the one trying to block the rest of you from accessing free culture online. I just want to apologize on behalf of America. Thank you. OK, so moving on, nationalism. This is a fun one as well. So of course, you don't want your people to be able to come up with ideas that are counter to the national narrative. And so nationalism, even though it's not usually outwardly used to justify censorship, nobody's saying, we're blocking this because it's not Egyptian enough. Nonetheless, it still becomes a factor in determining what to censor. Pointing this in the wrong direction. There we go. This is actually just an example, and it's really the only one of its kind in my slides. I just wanted to show you. This was actual data from 2005 in terms of how many sites in the religion category that Saudi Arabia was blocking. And it's interesting. You would think that they would be blocking more Jewish or Hindu sites than sites sort of categorized as Muslim. I didn't make these categorizations, by the way, and yet, look at all that. They're blocking. So this is, if you look specifically at the data and what sites under the sort of Islam category they were blocking, it was basically progressive ideas about Islam that Saudi did not consider acceptable. Whereas the other ones were kind of all over the place, and really you couldn't figure out why exactly this one had made it onto their list and another one hadn't. OK, so here's the point that I want to get to about Tunisia, and I mentioned this earlier. So like I said, by 2009, Tunisia had blocked just about every video sharing website. So Dailymotion, Vimeo, YouTube, et cetera, et cetera. I think that aptly explains this. And I don't want to get into the whole Facebook revolution conversation, but it was obvious that Tunisians were pretty grateful for Facebook. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's not because Facebook is some awesome company that does great stuff. It's because Facebook was the platform that was available. And so when you have all of these video sharing sites blocked, Facebook happens to be a social network, but it also happens to be a video sharing site. And the fact that all of these other sites were blocked contributed greatly to its importance in the Tunisian revolution. Just a point that I had to make there. So how do governments censor the internet? Now, I'm just going to tell you right now that I'm not a technologist. So I'm hoping at the end, if there's a Q&A, that I'll have some of my geeks in the room who can help me answer some of the questions that will come up about this. I'm not even going to talk about it that much, because I'm just going to assume that you're all smarter than I am. But basically, governments find all sorts of ways to censor. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the newer methods and controls and different ways that governments have found to crack down on internet users without just simply blocking sites. So this is actually quite simple. It's quite basic in terms of different ways that governments have found. More importantly, though, there's this sort of dichotomy in the region on how governments display their own censorship. And so censorship is cute and funny. This is an actual blog page from the United Arab Emirates. And this is an actual blog page from Qatar. I'm going to go back just so you can look at both of them. So in the Gulf countries, in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and I'm missing one, but nonetheless, censorship is generally done transparently. So not only do you know that it's being blocked, and you've got this cute little cartoon figure to tell you, hey, you can't get to this website, but you've also got this. And if you can't read that, here's what it said. Well, I'll just read this to you. The internet is a powerful medium for communication, sharing, and serving our daily learning needs. However, the site that you are trying to access contains content that is prohibited under the Internet Access Management Regulatory Policy of the communication, right? Not a democratically elected body of individuals, for the record. If you believe the website you are trying to access does not contain any such content, please click here. And it takes you to a form where you can tell them, no, you know, this website was wrongly blocked. Funny story. 2009, a friend of mine was in Yemen. And he's a researcher. He's actually from Yemen, so this is not a strange, like, hey, my friend was in Yemen. So a friend of mine was in Yemen, and he tried to access my blog. And it was blocked. I was like, Yemen? really? Like, what did I do to you? As it turns out, nothing. I did nothing. I'd never actually said a word about Yemen on my blog. What I had done was a very, very bad job of moderating comments. And the reason that my blog got blocked was because in my failure to moderate comments, I had gotten a lot of spam on this one post. And most of this spam contained outlinks to pornographic websites. Not really my fault, but I was just being lazy. So the software that the government of Yemen was using to censor the internet designated my blog through their automatic processes as a pornographic website. Now, that software was built by an American company, and I'm not going to name the company because they've actually completely turned their policies around and have done a really great job and promised not to sell to governments. Now, I actually do trust this one company. Generally speaking, that's not a promise that I take too seriously. But nonetheless, my blog was blocked in Yemen because of an American company's error. I just digest that for a moment. So this one's fun as well, of course. The other thing about Yemen, though, is that I managed to get my blog unblocked. Now, I talked to the company, but simultaneously, while I was telling the company how much of a problem this was, that they had miscategorized my blog, my friend in Yemen had gone and clicked the little thing and had told them, hey, this is a mistake, and they actually unblocked it. So governments actually, in some cases, are listening when there's an error, but they're not going to listen if you, say, want to unblock the Human Rights Watch page about Saudi Arabia. Saudi's not going to unblock that for you. And then you get to the countries that have not been so transparent about their censorship. And Tunisia, again, pre-revolutionary Tunisia, was not transparent at all. This graphic is created by a couple of Tunisian women, graphic artists, and it refers to Amr 404, which was the personification of internet censorship in Tunisia. This was this sort of character that had been created by activists to talk about censorship. And so the reason he's called Amr, Amr's his name, and Amr 404, the reason he's called that is because when you went to a website in Tunisia that was blocked, you would get a typical 404 error message. And so you wouldn't know necessarily if the website you were trying to reach just couldn't be reached, or if the government had blocked it. And this was very intentional. Tunisia was trying to project an image to the world that they were open. And in many ways they were, don't get me wrong, but in other ways they were an absolute dictatorship. And so you have this interesting, we're trying to be open, we want tourists to come. But if you look at the history, the World, what does it stand for? The World Society of Information, WSIS, the people in the room who know that will know what I'm talking about. I apologize to those who don't, was held in Tunisia in 2005. And there were Tunisian activists who tried to get in who were kicked out. There were bloggers arrested around that time. And so, they were trying to really kind of play the people. And obviously, that didn't work in the end. The technology. So the company that I was talking about before in Yemen is not here, but here's a bunch of different companies, including a German one, that all sell to foreign regimes. Now, when I say regime, I feel like it's not really fair, because some of these companies have also been implicated in censorship in my own country and in other democratically elected governments as well. But when we talk about authoritarian regimes censoring the internet, you've got kind of a different question. When you're talking about these Western companies, and Western, I'm going to use that term loosely, they're all from Canada, the United States, and Europe. These companies are all selling their wares for censorship or surveillance purposes to non-democratically elected governments. Now that we've got the definitions out of the way, let me tell you a little bit more about what this has meant for people. So in Egypt, I've talked to a lot of Egyptians who have said, honestly, in Egypt, it was surveillance for surveillance sake, for the most part. You had people who were able to get their records, of course, from the state security services after the fall of Mubarak. But in many cases, there were people being surveilled that didn't know they were being surveilled. They'd never been questioned. They'd never been arrested. Tunisia was totally different. You had a country where people were literally getting calls in the middle of the night threatening their family at times. And so governments use surveillance in all sorts of different ways. Bahrain is another example, and this is a rather tragic one because it's something that we still see ongoing. There were some activists in Bahrain who told us that they were beaten, arrested first, obviously, beaten, and then read text messages of theirs. And so they were being surveilled by the government, and that surveillance was being used to arrest and then torture them. thanks to all these lovely little companies. And you can't put all the blame on the companies, obviously. The regimes are the problem. But nonetheless, what's to be done about it? I'll get into that a little bit more, but I'll tell you from my perspective, there have been a lot of calls over the last year for regulation of these companies, and for example, for them to be sanctioned. There's a bill in the US right now called the Global Online Freedom Act that would effectively create a list of internet censoring countries that then American companies could not sell these technologies to. Now, there are a few problems with this. The first problem, of course, is who decides what an internet censoring country is. Is this based on research? Is it based on empirical data? Or is it based on what Hillary Clinton decides? I'm going to probably guess the latter, because that is written in the bill itself, that the Secretary of State, be it Clinton or the future one, determines what an internet restricting country is. But then the other problem there is that list going to be fair? Now, if it's not based on empirical data, then presumably it's based on anecdotal evidence or reports from, say, Freedom House or other organizations that do that. And that's fine, except I don't really trust that you'll not have Saudi Arabia, or that Saudi Arabia would be on that list. Saudi Arabia censors the internet, but they're a very close ally of my government. So this becomes a problem. The other problem, though, is with Syria and Iran and a few other countries. And that is that time and time again, Syrian activists have been telling me and other people who work in this space that they can't access Google Earth, Java, MSN Messenger, Skype, all sorts of different communications tools. And the reason for this is not that their government is blocking them, although I'm sure they'd like to. The reason for this is that the US government, specifically the Department of Commerce and the Department of Treasury, have restrictions that prevent these companies from selling their wares to Iran or Syria. Now, maybe that sounds like a good thing, except when we found, where is it, Blue Coat. Blue Coat last fall is a company that builds a variety of technologies, including routers, but also censorship and surveillance technology. And they had actually successfully, somehow, their products had successfully ended up in Syria with the government, used to surveil citizens. And yet, because of these other restrictions, Syrian citizens can't get a hold of important communications tools. And so there's an imbalance here created by that type of sanction. And that's why I don't know what the solution is. My organization, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, has been pushing a solution that would basically require companies to know their customer, to report transparently about who they're selling to and why and what exactly they're selling them. I think that this is one part of a solution. I don't think it will solve the problem. And then, of course, you've also got the problem that there are a bunch of companies, both natively in these countries, as well as places like China and Iran, where the regulations are not as strict. These companies are also developing similar software, so it's only a matter of time before you see an entirely different list of names on this screen, not necessarily coming from the US or Europe. So I mentioned this earlier, but next generation controls. This term was coined by a couple of researchers with the Open Net Initiative as well, so I am relying a lot on their prior research, but I think it's actually quite apt. So in the past, we've seen these governments just blocking websites. And the thing about blocking a website is that it's pretty easy to get to it anyway. Now, that doesn't justify the censorship by any means, but if I'm in Morocco and I find that LiveJournal is blocked, which I think it still is, but I want to get to it, I've got a whole bunch of tools at my disposal to get to it, from simple web proxies, where you just go to a URL and you type in the other URL into that proxy and it takes you to the site, and sometimes it's a bit difficult, but nonetheless. And you've got VPNs, and you've got more secure tools like Tor, which is an anonymizing tool, but that also allows you to circumvent. So again, censorship, kind of easy to get around. But then these other controls, these other insidious ways that governments have found to block access to information and to block information from getting out of a country, I think are much more dangerous in a lot of cases. Oh, my favorite guy. So surveillance. We've seen a lot of this in Syria, of course. But it's not, I don't want to just target Syria. I mean, I think it's an easy target at this point. And the surveillance in Syria has been pretty brutal. But we've also seen it in Bahrain, which is an ally of the US, where I'm from. And so we've seen a lot of troubling aspects. We've also seen this in the United States. We've seen AT&T and the National Security Agency surveilling, US citizens, and then we've seen the Obama administration blocking lawsuits against that. And so this is a problem that goes far beyond the Middle East and North Africa, and it goes far beyond authoritarian regimes. But for the sake of the region, I'm just going to talk about that again. And so I mentioned it before. I don't think I need to get into too much more detail, but I would say that this exists in just about every country, and just because people are not necessarily being arrested doesn't mean that the surveillance is not taking place. And I think that the key here is to ensure that internet users in these countries, and I'll get to the sort of what you can do at the end, but the key is to ensure that internet users in these countries know how to be safe online, know how to avoid being surveilled. And that's not an easy solution to fix. It's not easily scalable. Suppression. So I didn't change my presentation, but we just learned that this campaign over here just won an award with the Bobs, so I was very proud to see that. I can't really claim a lot of credit, I just helped coordinate. But Razan is a good friend of mine from Syria who's currently in prison for the 3rd time in the past 6 months. And she is a freedom of expression advocate and a blogger. But she's just one example. This is Ali Abdul-Imam from Bahrain, who is missing. He was sentenced to 15 years in absentia last year for basically for blogging, for running a website that was just considered too dangerous by the Bahraini government. And we don't know where he is. I'm actually going to the Oslo Freedom Forum after this, where he was supposed to speak last year and he was missing, and his wife is speaking in his place this year. And Hussein Khair, who's, I actually don't know him personally, but he's another Syrian blogger who is currently in prison along with Razan. These are just 3 examples of so many. Like I said before, Egypt never really blocked websites, but arrested bloggers. And didn't really even arrest them as bloggers, but found ways to arrest them as activists or as people taking part in a protest. And so there are circuitous ways that governments find to crack down on dissenters, essentially. In the region, we've seen a lot more lately away from blogging and towards social media. And so Kuwait right now has just passed a bill that would basically allow the death penalty for someone who blasphemes. And this happened because of someone on Twitter who had said something about God that the government didn't like. Saudi Arabia, a few months ago, the blogger and journalist named Hamza Kashgari fled the country after being threatened. He had a conversation on Twitter with God, an imaginary conversation, and he was threatened within an inch of his life, fled the country, and then was deported back to Saudi Arabia by Malaysia, which doesn't even have a treaty with them. So this has become a huge, huge issue, and I would encourage you to learn more about it. Actually, I would say the best resource right now, not to promote Global Voices again, because I'm sure you guys are sick of hearing the name, but really, they have a project called Threatened Voices. It's threatened.globalvoicesonline.org, and it tracks every possible instance that we can be aware of what's happening in the whole world, not just the Middle East and North Africa. And then another insidious way, state propaganda. This one really bothers me, I have to say, because I know several of the people on this list. But this is not limited to Syria either. So over the past year, and I think one of our previous speakers addressed this issue as well, but over the past year, we've seen these sort of wars between the activists online and the governments. And so governments that were previously not very savvy on using social media or using the internet have found ways to try to combat the citizens. I don't know that this is the Syrian government doing this. It very much could just be a group of supporters of the Syrian government. But what they've done is created this website called A Plot Against Syria, talking about how all of these people who support the Syrian revolution are terrorists. And yet, at least 2 of the people on that lower part, one of them is Wada Khanfar, the former head of Al Jazeera, so clearly he must be a terrorist. But then you've also got Syrian bloggers who, frankly, live in the US. I don't even really understand how they could be terrorists in that sense. But this is just one example. Like I said, we've seen similar things on Twitter with Syria and Bahrain. So about a year ago, I was on Twitter one day, and I was suddenly, my name, my @Jillian C. York on Twitter was being spammed with all of these tweets in Arabic with Syrian flags in the profiles. And they were, oddly enough, they were tweeting my own photographs from when I was in Syria back at me. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. And so I was sitting there, my Arabic is very slow, and so I'm sitting there very slowly reading what it said. And it was basically like, beautiful photo of Aleppo. I'm like, huh, that is a beautiful photo. I took it, thanks. thanks. And then I realized what they were doing. They were spamming the hashtag Syria to try to draw attention away from the opposition. And this was, a year ago, so this was just in the very beginning of protests in Syria before it got so complicated. They were trying to draw attention away from the hashtag, which people use to get news, and bring it toward these sort of irrelevant images. And this has died off a little bit, but where it's crept back up is with Bahrain. And what we found is that it's actually a PR company doing it for them. So it's not even individuals who love the Bahraini government. It's a paid PR company that puts out all these tweets. There are also individuals as well, and you may have seen last summer, the American journalist Nicholas Kristof, who writes for the New York Times, was getting hundreds of death threats from Bahrainis who were calling him a terrorist supporter because he had written about the opposition in the country. And so this is a continuing problem that we're seeing time and time again in a bunch of different places. And we've seen it a little bit with Israel and Palestine. We've seen it a little bit with the Occupy Wall Street protests. It's all over the place. And then you've got other tactics. So just-in-time censorship, I hate that term, I really do, but it's another one that somebody already established and it's already out there. This is what Egypt did before they shut down the network. So Egypt, I'm going to get the order wrong, but January 26th, they blocked Twitter first, I think. January 27th was Facebook, that might be flipped. And then 27th, they shut down the internet. That was basically in a desperate attempt to try to mitigate the way that these social networks were already being used to organize and foment dissent. And we've seen this in a bunch of other places as well. Network shutdowns, too. There was a lot of media claiming that Egypt was the first country in the world to shut down their network, but that's not even remotely true. There's like 3 before that. Burma did it. China did it to one entire province, Xinjiang province. And there's another country, and I'm not going to remember it, but this has happened before. Network shutdowns are kind of a difficult one, and I think I'm probably going to paraphrase Zeynep if she's in the room on this one. But oh, there she is, raising her arms. Zeynep has made this point before on the dictator's dilemma, so I think I've changed the terms a little bit, but basically this is how I see it. Tunisia heavily censored the internet for years, and then the night before Ben Ali flees the country, he says, okay, we're going to open up the internet. And then he had to leave anyway, so that didn't really work. Egypt, seeing that, goes, okay, well, we're not going to block websites because that's been kind of a failure. We're just going to shut down the internet entirely. Didn't really work. So Syria, being as smart as it is, decided not to do either of those things, and is instead, this is my favorite, in February 2011, Syria unblocked 3 websites. Now, this was before protests in Syria had really picked up. My opinion is that Syria was seeing the response to the network shutdown in Egypt and to the situation in Tunisia and decided to unblock these websites, but at the very same time, they were ramping up their surveillance capabilities. And so what happens when you unblock Facebook, but then you have this surveillance there? It actually makes it much easier for the government to go after people because they're not using proxies to get to the site. Because I think a lot of times when people think about getting around censorship, they're not thinking about safety, they're just thinking, how do I get to that website? And that's a problem. Coercion of private companies. Now, I don't know how many people saw my talk last year, so I don't want to re-give it. But basically, last year I talked about how corporations like Facebook and Google and all of the rest of them, no exceptions here, have content policies that are not compliant. And they're American companies, so apologize in advance for my extreme Americanness on this one. But they have policies that are not compliant with the First Amendment of the Constitution, which basically is, promoting free expression. And so these companies have rules that are essentially geared toward being family-friendly. And that means that if you want to post, say, a violent video of even, let's say, a police officer beating someone, legit, that's a legitimate thing to post on the internet, I think, Facebook or YouTube might not allow it. YouTube actually will at this point because they've listened. And so there was an Egyptian sort of citizen journalist, Wael Abbas, who in 2007 had been uploading videos of police brutality to YouTube. And YouTube took them down. And luckily, he was pretty connected with all of these different communities that I think Zeynep spoke about earlier. But he managed to talk to people who could then talk to YouTube, who then basically convinced YouTube to put the videos back up. And as a result, YouTube actually changed its policy. And so I think that's had a huge impact now, because you wouldn't be able to see these graphic, and not that you necessarily want to see them, but they're important. You wouldn't be able to see these graphic videos coming out of Bahrain or Syria or Egypt or Tunisia today if YouTube hadn't shifted that policy. Which is not to say YouTube isn't is the only place on the internet. And I realize that there are other video sharing sites, but the point is it's the centrally located one that everyone uses. And so if they have this policy, they're essentially preventing activists from fully engaging in their site. YouTube now says that you can put up a violent video if it is educational or documentary in nature. So that's good. Maybe it's still wrong of them to block gratuitous violence, but at least it's a step forward. Nonetheless, it's still not compliant with the First Amendment. Now, that has nothing to do with coercion, of course. These are these companies' own policies, but we've seen governments effectively threatening companies, and those companies saying, OK, we'll censor for you. This happened with Facebook in Pakistan. Pakistan had a very strong reaction, if you remember, back in 2005 or 6, whatever year it was, to the Danish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. And so when, in 2010, that whole conversation was revived by an artist, an American artist, actually, who, frankly, I think her goal was a little bit different than what ended up happening, but she created a day called Everyone Draw Muhammad Day. Now, I see why this is offensive, don't get me wrong, but that's still not an argument for censorship. What happened was that Pakistan said, we're going to block Facebook unless Facebook blocks these pages. And Facebook agreed and decided to start specifically blocking stuff for Pakistan. Twitter recently came out with a policy that says that if a government gives them a legal request, a valid legal request, then they will take down content that is against the laws of that country. YouTube has done this with Turkey as well, things that insult Turkishness, which I love that, insulting Turkishness. Things that insult Turkishness, I don't love insulting Turkishness, that's not what I meant. But things that insult Turkishness, YouTube will block them for Turks only, but they will be accessible elsewhere. Now, I've got a real problem with this, not just because it's censorship, because I've got a real problem with anything that's censorship, as you might imagine, but because when you block a website, you can still get around it. Might not be easy, but you can still circumvent. When a company agrees to take down content for a government, that content is gone forever. Now, maybe not forever. There are mirrors, et cetera, but nonetheless, if all of these companies agreed to do this for all of these countries, then where's our free internet? Where's the street? Where is the public sphere online? It doesn't exist anymore. But again, if you saw my talk last year, you know how I feel about this. And so the coercion of private companies, huge problem. And then bad regulation. There's so much bad internet regulation. My country, like I said before, copyright. So I'm not being hypocritical about this. I promise you I'm fighting against that too. But bad regulation happens even worse, I would say, in countries where internet penetration is low, people are not used to civic engagement, and where the lawmakers are, just like in the US, a bunch of old men that don't know the internet. So I'm going to come to those examples in a minute. I'm not going to stop talking about the regulation bit. So 2012, where do we stand right now? So censorship in some countries has become a little bit more transparent. Now, I'm a big advocate of transparency, and so, Twitter, when they came out with that policy that said that they'll block per country, the one thing that I was grateful for was that they said that they would at least put up a mark that says this tweet has been removed, so that you know that censorship is happening. Now, again, not advocating for censorship, I think you know me by now, but nonetheless, I would much rather know that censorship is occurring than come to Amr 404 like happened in Tunisia. And so now Tunisia, and to his credit, the director of Tunisia's internet agency is like the coolest activist, really believes in free expression, but unfortunately has been under a lot of heat to block certain things. And what happened last year, this is from, I think, mid-2011, probably around May or June of last year. So the situation has changed a little bit. But the first thing that happened was that a military court ordered the Tunisian Internet Agency in May 2011 to block access to 5 Facebook pages of terrorists. Now, I think a couple of them might have been like borderline what you might consider a terrorist. I don't know who they were, to be honest. But at least one of them was just literally a dissident. And that's the first guy. And so you've got these court orders, and the Tunisian Internet Agency decided to be transparent about this and put up a website that explained what was being censored. Now, the red circle at the bottom is the other thing that they had to censor. I assume that your French is better than mine. But in this case, a civil court ordered that the Tunisian government, or that the Tunisian Internet Agency block pornography. So that debate is still ongoing. It was recently reached the highest court in the country, the Court of Cassation. It was referred back down to the appeals court. We don't know what the decision is going to be at this point. But if that happens, as you know, if you follow these stories, it's only a slippery slope from there. And I think that putting those systems back into place, which is the same argument that the director of the Tunisian Internet Agency and activists in the country have had, once you put those systems back in place, they can easily be abused. Apologies for the weird little tag over there. This is another example. You've got these governments cracking down even further. So Kuwait, members of parliament, okayed the death penalty recently for cursing God. Again, like I mentioned before, this happened after a Twitter user was arrested for doing just that. And so then they approved the death penalty. We don't know what's going to happen to this guy at this point. And the bad regulation bit. This is actually a lovely example because they killed the bill, and I'm so proud of my friends in Lebanon for this. There was this bill called the Lebanese Internet Regulation Act, or LIRA, which is funny because Lebanese currency is called the lira also. Hands off my freedom, stop LIRA. LIRA was terrible, and here's just a couple things that it did. Number one, if you were Lebanese, and thank you, if you lived in Lebanon, you could only have one website. If you were a politician, you could not blog. Those are just 2 examples. And this bill was absolutely absurd. Activists managed to shoot it down, but it's only going to rear its head again. And this is happening in Jordan right now as well. There's discussion of a bill that would also include some copyright measures. And in Iraq, there was recently a bill proposed that would have a mandatory life sentence for anyone who, I'm not going to get the term right, but basically anyone who did something online that could disrupt the state. Like, it was very vaguely worded, and there was a whole list of other things. And so, you know, the intent of some of these, I mean, another part of the Iraqi bill that was good was the prevention of online theft. And so they had some measures in there that made sense, but in large part, it was a lack of understanding of the internet. And surveillance, which I think I've talked about plenty at this point, so I'm just going to move on. So what can you do? Oh, gosh. Aside from coming, you know, and volunteering with us, the EFF, or other organizations that are doing the same thing, here's what I would say, and I'm just going to give you 5 quick steps, and then I'll take some questions, because I just got the 15-minute marker. Support technology and advocacy. If you want me to tell you exactly what technology to support, I think that there's more than one, but the easiest one, and especially because you've got people here from there, is the Tor project. If you're not familiar with Tor, like I mentioned before, it's an anonymizing tool, rather, that also allows you to circumvent censorship. It's not perfect, no tool is, but it's really the best one out there right now, and it's a nonprofit, so highly recommend supporting it if you don't already. And then supporting advocacy. Again, EFF is not the only organization that will happily take your money or your membership, but you know, you've got organizations in Germany, you've got organizations in whatever country you're from, I'm sure. And if you don't have one, then please come talk to me about how to start one, because that's one thing that I love to do, is advise people in whatever country they're in on how to work on these issues. Building new tools, again, like I said, I think Tor is the best one out there right now, but that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be more. And so if you're a developer, think about spending some of your free time on working on new solutions. Naming and shaming companies. So I mentioned earlier with surveillance, some of these companies, I think Trovicor is a German company, and I think that they've sold to more than one government at this point. Write about it, talk about it, spread the word. Have a protest about it. That's what we're doing. And actually, I'll give you one success story. Italy. Anyone from Italy? OK, I don't have glasses on, but I don't know if any hands went up. there was a company called Area Spa that had been working with the Syrian government to build a surveillance system. And the protests outside of their headquarters in Italy were so strong that they backed out of the deal. So this does work at times. It's not going to create the perfect solution, but it's the best thing that I've come up with at this point. Amplify local efforts, so whether that be from your country or from a country that you have an affinity to, make sure that these stories are heard. So the Lebanese Internet Regulation Act did not get a lot of press outside of Lebanon, and so that was one thing where if I had had more time in my, my copious free time, I would have written about that to make sure that people, not just in the US, I would try to find the right platform, but make sure that people know about this and make sure that these networks are building and happening so that we learn from each other's mistakes from country to country. In the US, I think that we did a great job of fighting, at least for now, SOPA and PIPA, the two copyright-related bills. But these are going to happen in other countries, specifically as more countries have these industries. This is going to become an issue in more and more places, and so we need to learn from each other's efforts. And then, of course, spread the word, which, frankly, is the same thing. Sorry about that. So that's me. That's where you can find me. That's me on Twitter. That's where I work. I usually have a lolcat here, but I forgot. Sorry. And now I'll take questions if you have any. Thanks.
So, gibt es denn da Fragen? Are there any questions to Jillian?
Hi, Jillian. Thanks for the nice talk. I was wondering, when those Western companies sell surveillance gear to various governments, what are the current efforts directed to make those contracts go through Ministry of Foreign Affairs as weapon gear? Right? Because I know that from some French activists are trying to put this more on the scene, on the political scene, since the Amesis Bull scandal got out with Libya. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so you have the, and I'm terrible with acronyms, but the FIDH, is it the, somebody help me out, in France? So there's a human rights legal group in France that is working on creating legislation. In the US, we have, as I mentioned, the Global Online Freedom Act, which I don't support in its current form, but which could be improved to a point where I might support it. The European Parliament is also working on these efforts. I think the way you phrase that is a great question, because I think that the key is not to prevent all companies from exporting, but to make sure that they have to report through a foreign ministry, or in the US it would be the Department of Commerce, et cetera. And so I've heard of efforts like this, and I'm terrible at remembering precise details, but you can definitely email me if you have more questions and I can pull up the information. Efforts like this I know exist in the UK, France, European Parliament, and the US. Canada is a country that's doing nothing about it, and they know that it's a problem. So that's one area where you could lobby if you're from Canada. But yeah, so that's what I know of so far. I'm sorry that I... Feel free to email me for more detail.
Hier ist jetzt noch eine Frage.
Hello, thank you very much for the great presentation. I have a question. You talked about companies that sell technologies to the repressive regimes, and other entities will play a crucial role in this. For example, internet intermediaries and, for example, social networking providers. Over the years, with your experience, how do you perceive the willingness to cooperate with repressive regimes from these companies?
So that's a great question as well. So basically, you've got all of these companies like Google, Facebook, et cetera, as well as, unless, the surveillance companies are a different issue because they largely exist to create software that is, in my opinion, bad. Whereas Facebook, YouTube, Google largely exist, yes, to make money, but also to create platforms that allow you to have social interactions. And so there's questions around, is it right for Google to enter China? Was it right for Google to enter China back when it did? Is it right for Google to stay in India now with all of the regulations that are happening there? And Twitter, of course, is having some issues in the UK right now, as you may have seen. The UK has been cracking down pretty heavily, and I don't know what that's all about, but they've been jailing people for racist tweets, which from a US perspective I find shocking, even though I hate racism. I don't know which I hate more, racism or censorship. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to these companies making these decisions, I think that it's kind of too late when we're thinking about the huge companies. What I would like to do is start talking to the little companies, the companies that are just starting up now, and create a set of best practices for how you decide to enter a certain jurisdiction. Because the problem is, once a company enters a jurisdiction, they're subject to local laws. And it's really easy to say, OK, just get out. But when you do that, you're putting your local employees at risk, and you're potentially, pulling back from a level of freedom that may not have existed. And I hate that argument, but it's still true that when Google had its search engine in China, you could get better and more results from Google than you could from the Chinese search engine equivalent. And so there is a question there: is Google essentially providing more freedom, or are they just, subject to the Chinese government's whims? And it can be a difficult balance. I mean, I know I'd like to be really hardcore about it and say, yeah, no, Google should never enter China, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And so I think that the key is going to be to talking to smaller startup companies and helping them make better decisions about what jurisdictions to enter.
Hier drüben noch eine Frage.
Hi, my name is Diani Brito. It's great to see you. I enjoyed it very much. I missed the first part, so I don't know if I'm asking something that you already answered. I'm a human rights activist, Net Freedom for Cuba, and they're very beleaguered. They have very low penetration, censorship galore. It's a very, very, very drastic situation right now, and it seems like the world is not paying attention. Today was World Press Day, and most of them have been arrested 5 times in the last week, and that's just the way the government is going against bloggers and stuff. Would you have any advice for them?
So, yeah, I mean, Cuba, I have to say, I'll be honest, I'm not an expert on Cuba, and Cuba is a country where I think you actually have to really understand it and know it. I just don't feel equipped to talk about it. But what I would say in terms of how to deal with it, I think it's a really tricky one, because you've got the same situation with Cuba that you do with Syria and Iran, in that these companies that want to provide good technology, they can't because of sanctions. Right. Yeah, because of these sanctions. And so I actually think that it's really key to get rid of these sanctions, especially in the US. They're not doing any good. They're just helping regimes while they're hurting citizens. And I don't mean all sanctions. That's not my area to decide. I mean sanctions that prevent technology from getting to citizens. They rarely hurt the regimes. They always harm the citizens. And so I think that's the first key. And it does apply to Cuba as well. I mean, Cuba's such a hard one, because you have...
maybe the your foundation could help the bloggers get more voice, because it's a very desperate situation. I mean, they have like €4 a tweet, and that's maybe what happens, and then just gets lost because...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's tough with Cuba. I mean, there's just so many different difficulties with it, because there's the one thing that, like, when you come in to help people in Cuba, then that person might be then targeted as somebody who's working with foreigners, because it's such a tense environment. I mean, there's certainly ways to mirror and amplify tweets. So yeah, it's true. Like, these tweets can quickly be cut down, and so perhaps one solution is trying to find alternative ways of getting messages out. Speak to tweet was a great thing that happened with in Egypt when the internet was shut down. That might not be the right solution. I don't know. Okay, yeah, so then, I don't know, but I'm happy to discuss it more. Sure.
Wir haben da hinten noch eine Frage. Da drüben in der Ecke.
Hi, Jillian. Thank you very much. Can you hear?
Oh, okay.
All right. Thanks for excellent presentation. Of course, there are certain unjust things that the governments all over the world they do, and that must be reported. However, freedom of expression is a very relative term, and in your capacity as a director of your foundation, I wanted to know that freedom of expression could mean different things to different countries. It has a certain sensitive issues involved. For example, the country that we are actually hosting this event, there are certain sensitive issues that we cannot talk even in this country, and you exactly know which one do I mean. Similarly, in other parts of the world, for example, you mentioned the Muhammad's caricatures, which I personally found a little humorous, but certain other people did not really find it. And if the governments had not asked these companies, it would have happened that they would have banned the products, they would have banned the Western products, and which actually happened. So I wanted to know, in your capacity, how do you see these things? Because they are a little sensitive. You mentioned Pakistan, and recently, last year, the governor of the major province was shot dead by his own elite squad member just because he was talking about the blasphemy law. Although he did not talk, but the media projected in that way. So freedom is a pretty relative term. So how do you see that? Thank you.
Sure, sure. So yeah, I mean, it is complicated. So I declare myself a free expression absolutist, and I am. I will be absolutely upfront about that, and I'm always upfront about that with anyone that I work with. But at the same time, it's true that there are places in which you even if it's not against the law, you choose to express yourself on a certain subject, and you could be killed for it. Same with here, again, this is a country that does have stricter laws, stricter censorship than my country, and so, or at least in law, not necessarily in practice. And so that's an issue as well. There are sensitive topics, and it does depend on countries, but I'm not a big fan of that kind of relativism. And I have to say that I don't think, particularly when it comes to the internet, which is a global platform, I don't think that we're ever going to get to a point of change unless we can open up these platforms, unless we can open up our discussions, even around these painfully sensitive topics. And so when it comes to censoring the internet, I've always said this, once you put the system in place, every single situation, every single government where we've ever, and I will stand by this sentence, every country that has ever put a system in place to block websites has overblocked. So when Australia was trying a few years ago to create this opt-in voluntary system to block pornography, their blacklist of pornography websites included the website of a dentist. Censorship systems do not work. And so I will oppose them on principle, but I will also oppose them on the fact that there's always collateral damage. And so I think that there's a difference sort of when it comes to what we can see and what we can talk about. So I want to start with what we can see, and then let's see it and get to the point where we can talk about it. And I know that that's not a perfect answer. And I will say also that if I'm dealing with Pakistan, for example. Pakistan recently put out a call, the Pakistani Telecommunications Authority recently put out a call for people to build a censorship system which would allow them to block 50 million websites or whatever, and very quickly. And I worked with 2 different Pakistani groups, and they diametrically opposed each other on certain principles around free expression. One group was like, this is the cold-blooded murder of the internet. The other group was like, well, we get that certain subjects are tricky, but as I just said, and they said this, I didn't tell them to say this, they said once you put that system in place, it will be abused. And so I found that a lot of people in these sensitive environments, their particular way of fighting it is not to say this is the cold-blooded murder of the internet, because that doesn't work in terms of messaging. What they're saying instead is the same thing that I just said, and I didn't come up with this. I learned this from the people that I work with in different countries, which was once you put these systems in place, these systems will be abused and there will be collateral damage. So you start there and then you move on.
Noch eine letzte Frage wäre drin. Ansonsten, ja, vielen, vielen Dank. Thank you very much.
Thank you.